I'm Bill. Lois and I often walk on the back roads and trails near our house here at Bedford Hills. Today, though, she's gardening. We believe that this sort of consistent exercise has kept us in the good health that we still enjoy. We have seen a great deal of AA history in the making since we moved here in 1941, something that it is most wonderful to remember.
I'm Lois. Bill and I are so grateful that we have been able to live and work together here in the country. Bill has a studio on our hill where he writes. I work in the garden and carry on with Al-Anon at my desk upstairs. Welcome to Stepping Stones, dear friends.
Well, I think perhaps the best place to start this narrative would be on a summer night in 1934 at Towns Hospital, that famous drying out emporium in New York where I had so often been. On this occasion, I was there next to my last time, and the news was all bad. I knew that you were talking to the doctor downstairs, dear old Dr. Silkworth, who has become enshrined in our hearts in all the years since as nothing less than a medical saint.
I never will forget his telling me that you were absolutely hopeless, that he'd once thought that there was hope. But now he was afraid I would have to commit you, or you would die of alcoholism, or go insane.
He had intimated that to me before, as you well know, that this could be the end of the line. But up until this point, I had had some hope myself. As you remember, he had described alcoholism to us as a sort of terrible compulsion to drink against one's will, against one's happiness, and against one's best interest. A compulsion not too often overcome by an individual on his own resources. Attached to this, he thought there was a physical condition, an allergy, so that if the drinking persisted, it eventually meant insanity or death. And meanwhile, great desolation indeed, which had been our lot. I well remember leaving the hospital after this fatal sentence had been passed upon me and indeed upon you. This time, I had a fear of alcohol that I had never known in such an intensity before. And I suppose it was mainly fear and constant vigilance that kept me sober for the next few months. I remember how you made every effort, how we went on many walks, how we read together, how we exerted every possible resource we could to combat this thing. Then I remember how I began to feel better, how confidence returned, though false confidence it proved to be. Little by little, the horror of the experience of towns lessened, almost disappeared. I even went back over to Wall Street and was able to pick up a few dollars. Perhaps things weren't so hopeless as the doctor had said. Then came that day when you had to work in the department store. It was November 11th, 1934, Armistice Day. And I proposed to go to Staten Island to play some golf all by myself. I, of course, thought that, well, I've certainly got to make it this time. But no, again I was stricken. Again I vaguely remember faces and buses, and then oblivion. And then comes a part of the story that I don't remember, but which you certainly must.
Well, I found you in the areaway, I remember, with a great gash across your face and dragging the golf clubs. You certainly were a sad-looking sight. And I had to take you in and put you to bed.
I guess you even had a lot of trouble getting me upstairs. When I came around this time, I was truly hopeless. For the first time, I could see myself as a denizen of a mental hospital. For perhaps a week, I drank on. And if that were possible, the utter hopelessness of our situation was borne in on me. I seldom left the house except to get gin. I was either on my bed asleep or downstairs in the kitchen, my favorite drinking spot. While there, on a bleak afternoon in that month of November, the telephone suddenly rang. I went, and I heard the voice of an old school friend, the one now so well and affectionately known to AA as Ebby. I asked him to come over, sensing, however, that he was in New York sober. I couldn't remember a time when he had paid such a visit. Soon he was at the outer door. I looked through the grating at him, and even in my haze, I at once perceived that something extraordinary had happened. He greeted me very cheerily. I stumbled inside. We sat at the kitchen table. I pushed across to him a pitcher of gin flavored with pineapple juice. And at this point, he shook his head and with a smile said, "Well, I'm not drinking just now." Well, this mystified and also disappointed me. I thought that he and I could retreat into the past. I knew that he had been threatened by commitment to an institution, and the same threat overhung me. So we were companions in misery. But he wasn't miserable at all. I couldn't understand it. Something had happened. So I said to him, Ebby, what's got into you? Why won't you drink and talk about the good old days? Well, he said, I'll put it to you in a few words. I've got religion. Well, that was a terrific blow to me. I just couldn't understand a man like Ebby getting religion. After all, I'd had one of these wonderful scientific trainings that had taught me that man evolved from the ooze, and that was it. So here was my friend. He'd got religion. Well, I knew I had to be polite, so I said, well, Ebby, could you tell me what brand this is? Well, he wouldn't commit himself to saying it was a brand. He told of his association with the Oxford groups and how they emphasized getting honest with one another, with making a survey of their defects, admitting that they were powerless without the help of God. Cliches of that sort, they seemed to be then. And then he told how, when he had become willing to try these simple expedients and to try helping another without any thought of reward, he had been released, as he said, from this awful compulsion to drink. Well, his story made an impression on me. It was bound to, because after all, we were blood brothers under the skin, victims of the same malady. So what he had to say struck me deep. There was nothing new in the principles he advocated, but here he was, living proof of their effectiveness. One alcoholic talking to another, forming the first link in the chain that has become Alcoholics Anonymous of today. Well, at this juncture, Lois came home and found us both there. I think she was dismayed at first, but she saw that at least Ebby was sober. So can you remember your reaction as you came down into the kitchen?
I wasn't entirely happy about the whole setup.
Well, my dear, you couldn't be blamed for that. I can't seem to remember what happened then. Ebby took his leave at some point, but in no waking hour in the days that followed could the memory of his face and what he had to say leave me. I kept returning to it again and again. The drinking went on, but not at such a heavy pace. Of course, I was nonplussed that he believed in God. The idea of getting honest with oneself, with other people, with helping others, that would all come easy. But that it was necessary for me to believe in God to achieve recovery from alcoholism, well, this just couldn't be. So, in a way, the first effect of his talk upon me was to deepen my dilemma. Perhaps I was within sight of salvation, but still unable to reach the other shore. And so my thinking went on, and so did the drinking. Until one morning, after Lois had left for the department store, where she was working to support me, I resolved to go back to see Dr. Silkworth at Towns Hospital. Ask him to sober me up again, so that I could get a clear view of Ebby and his cure for drinking. I remember on the way buying a lot of beer, drinking most of it, coming into the hospital waving a bottle, shouting at the doctor that this time I had something. Well, this dear old man who really loved me shook his head sadly and said, I guess you have. You'd better get upstairs and go to bed. So to bed I went. This time I was physically still in pretty good shape. The drinking hadn't got on long enough. So, in a matter of 2 or 3 days, I was well off the liquor, but still fearfully depressed, still in the grip of my awful dilemma. How was I to achieve a belief in God were that required to stop my drinking? I became more and more morose. I just couldn't see how this corner could be got around. At about 11 o'clock in the morning of the third day, my friend Abby stood in the door. As before, bright and cheerful. I remember being a little suspicious of him. I thought perhaps this time he'd turn on the evangelical heat. But no, he was a prudent man. We chatted about everything excepting drinking. And it finally put me in the position of having to ask him again about those simple principles for recovery. This admitting you were hopeless, well, that wasn't too hard. This getting honest with yourself and another person, well, one could do that. This making restitution for harms done other people. A tough job, but certainly one would try that. Working with others without any demand for money or acclaim. Well, that would be just wonderful. But when he came to the God part, again, I remember a terrible balking and rebellion. He also told me a little bit about his own recovery and what had preceded it. A friend of his, a prominent American businessman, having exhausted all of the cures of note in the United States, had 2 or 3 years earlier taken himself to Europe, where he was put under the care of Dr. Carl Jung. Dr. Jung was one who thought that man was more than $2 worth of chemicals, a bundle of instincts, and a certain amount of intelligence. He thought that man had a soul. Nevertheless, after a whole year's treatment, Hazard again relapsed on leaving the doctor. Returning, he had asked if there was any further hope. He had thought the doctor to be his court of last resort. And Dr. Jung, a great and humble man, said, Roland, my art cannot save you. But there is one other resource. That is a spiritual experience. Something that will transform you, expel this compulsion, and enable you to do what you couldn't do before. So Hazard had brought this message to Ebby. It was much the same kind of a message that I had received from Dr. Silkworth. I was hopeless so far as my own resources were concerned, and this message coming to me through this new channel intensified my depression. Now again, I must make the point that on his second visit, Ebby made no attempt to evangelize me. He just stuck to his own story, and then when this was finished, he took his departure. When he went, I sunk into the most unbearable depression that I had ever known. I suppose that momentarily at least, the last vestige of my prideful obstinacy was crushed out. I was just a child, crying alone, very alone, in the dark. For the extremity of this agony, I can find no words. And then I remember crying out, if there is a God, will he show himself? And then came the miracle, the great central experience of my whole life. The room instantly lit up in a blinding glare of white light. I was seized by an ecstasy such as I had never known. It seemed to me that I then stood on a mountaintop where a great clean wind was blowing. I thought to myself, but this is not air, this is spirit. This is the God of the preacher. How long I remained in this state, I just cannot say. And again, I have no words to describe what it was like. At length, however, I found myself on the bed, but now I was in a new world. A world in which everything was right, despite the wrongs of the world I had been living in. I felt myself filled with the consciousness of the presence of Spirit, of God. A great peace stole over me. And there I laid and reveled in this new and loving consciousness.
Yes.
At length I became truly frightened. I thought I was hallucinating. So I called Dr. Silkworth, told him the story as best I could, and said to him, Doctor, am I hallucinating? Have I gone crazy? He questioned me. And at length, he said, no, Bill, he said, you are not crazy. Some great psychic event has occurred. I can feel it. I can see it, but I can't define it. Whatever it is, it's much better than what had you only an hour ago.
Hold on.
And you'd better hold on to what you have. Well, this was great news to me. The next big piece of news came in the form of a book brought to me by my friend Ebby on his next visit. This book was written by William James and was called Varieties of Religious Experience. Though the experiences were of many kinds, I at once saw that they'd had transformed people, and that nearly all of these experiences in this book had to do with people who had found themselves in an utterly hopeless state. A state of mind or existence where there was no way around, under, or over. Well, this was what had happened to me. And in this book, I found experiences similar to my own. And best of all, the great William James thought that these experiences had objective reality. Following the reading of this book, there came to me a vision of a chain reaction among alcoholics, in which each recovered man would come to the next, hope in one hand and hopelessness in the other, saying in effect, If you are an alcoholic, you have an obsession that condemns you to drink, an allergy that condemns you to die. Your only resource is a spiritual experience. If, then, the doctors were quoted upon the hopelessness of the situation, the god of medicine would in effect say to each newcomer, our resources will not bring you back to life. In short, and paradoxically, the chances of the alcoholic to recover by the spiritual experience means would be just in proportion to his hopelessness. Yes, the secret would be deflation at depth, using the tools given us by science, the compulsion plus the allergy. Then when one alcoholic carried this message to the next, he could reach the newcomer where he lived, even below consciousness. Then bringing about the deflation, he would create a dependence of the newcomer upon his sponsor, upon a group if there were any, and finally upon God. In some such form, the concept of such a possible chain reaction occurred to me. Leaving the hospital shortly afterward, I joined up with the Oxford groups, and along with Ebby and Roland and 2 or 3 other drunks, we began to work with alcoholics. The result was almost nil. In my case, it was absolutely nil, because at that time I was insisting that everybody have a spiritual experience just like mine. I'm afraid that I was preaching, and I was pontificating. I tried dozens of drunks at Towns Hospital, where Silkworth let me talk to them, and scores more we found in a mission connected with Calvary Church, whose rector was Dr. Sam Shoemaker, whose influence was to be so great upon our destiny. But still nothing much happened. Either the drunks would tap their heads and look the other way, or they might stay sober a matter of weeks or months and then flop dismally. So little by little, I discovered that I had converted my wonderful experience into a foolish rationalization by which I myself had begun to play God. At this juncture, I tried to get back into business. And then came an opportunity to engage in the struggle for a control of a small machine tool company in Akron, Ohio. It was getting chilly out here. Lois, you look as cold as you can be.
Well,
why don't we go inside and continue there, and maybe you'd make us a pot of coffee.
Okay, let's go.
Well, I was on the way to Akron in the company with a number of newly found business friends. We expected, as I think I said outside, that we would capture a company. Of course, drunk-like, I expected to be the president. Well, what about to work with alcoholics? Oh, well, I would, do it on the side. So bravely we set out. The proxy fight came off. Our side was handsomely licked. All of them went home, but I stayed in the hotel for the simple reason I didn't have the fare and no one offered to give it to me. So here I was on a Saturday afternoon, alone in the Mayflower Hotel at Akron, Ohio. I walked down to the lobby, strode back and forth. At one end there was a plaque with the names of the various churches and preachers. At the other end of my beat there was a bar room. The bar room was filling up, and so were the people in it. And that buzz, so characteristic of bars, had a pleasant sound to me. Soon I found myself saying, well, perhaps I could go in there and have a drink of ginger ale and possibly scrape an acquaintance to pass away this lonely afternoon. And then I caught myself and thought, well, I have been restored to sanity. I can see I'm in danger. I walked over to the church directory again, thinking, well, now perhaps I had better find an alcoholic that I might talk to. Because at last I see that I need such a person as much as he could possibly need me. No more of this preaching I had been doing in New York. So here I was, standing in front of the church directory, wondering what next. It suddenly occurred to me that perhaps one of the preachers on the list there could refer me to a drunk that I might work on. My fingers slid down across the list and finally stopped at the name of Walter Tunks, later to become a wonderful friend of AA, and who happened to be the Episcopal rector in town. So I called up the good Reverend, explained my need for a drunk to work on. At first he was rather nonplussed. He almost remarked that one drunk at a time is enough. Anyhow, he caught the drift of what I needed, and he referred me to still another person, a member of the Oxford groups in Akron. And from him, I secured a list of about 10 people that might, any one of them, put me in contact with a drunk. Well, I felt better, went upstairs, got on the phone, and one after one, the calls fell through. They didn't answer. They could perhaps see me in church on Sunday. One after another, the list was all gone, excepting the very last name. And this name was Henrietta Seiberling. And I connected her with Frank Seiberling, the rubber tycoon who I'd met years before. Well, I couldn't imagine going to Mrs. Seiberling on a Saturday afternoon, asking if she knew of a drunk that I might work on. I even went downstairs and walked up and down some more. Suddenly, something said to me, you had better call that number. So I did call, and a warm southern voice came over the wire. This was Henrietta Seiberling. She was the daughter-in-law, not the one I thought. I explained my need, and she said, well, I'm no alcoholic, but I've had my troubles. I think I understand. Won't you come right straight out here? In no time, I stood before Henrietta's house, which was the gatehouse to that great estate. She met me in the door, showed me in. and listened while I poured out my story. Finally, she said, I think you should meet Dr. Bob. He's a surgeon here in town. He's been in our Oxford groups. He's tried all sorts of cures. I'm sure he wants to stop drinking, but he simply can't. The family is in awful shape. The kids are in disarray. Henrietta went on to say that Ann Smith, Bob's wife, was about on the verge of a nervous breakdown. Moreover, the mortgage on the house was close to being foreclosed. Things just simply couldn't be worse. So, said Henrietta, would you like to talk with him? Well, I certainly thought I would. I needed him as much as he needed me.
Fine, Bill. Suppose we have a cup of coffee.
Good idea. That looks grand. Sugar lady?
Take any cream.
No, never got back to it. Well, shall we go on? Henrietta got onto the phone, and Ann Smith replied immediately. Was Dr. Bob there? Well, said Ann Smith, he's just come in. As you know, it's Mother's Day. He's brought me a wonderful potted plant, but I'm afraid, Henrietta, that we can't come. He is so potted that the plant is on the table, but he is on the floor under the table and can't get up. Maybe we can do better tomorrow. I shall never forget the next day. It was a Sunday. Henrietta had had me out there for an early dinner. And at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the doorbell rang, and there stood Dr. Bob and Ann. Ann looking slightly hopeful, but Bob not looking a bit like a founder. He was shaking violently. He said, I have another engagement. I don't believe that I can stay but a few minutes. Henrietta took in the situation at once, and with her usual understanding, she insisted that Dr. Bob and I go into the library where we could chat. So here it was. One drunk talking to another, because the one talking needed the message too. So first I unfolded Dr. Silfver's ideas about alcoholism, how it was an actual disease, how the body developed a sensitivity which he called an allergy, and worse still, how the mind and emotions began to be beset with a compulsion that condemned us to go on drinking, and therefore to go mad or to die, a point at which Dr. Bob was certainly approaching. Afterward, he told me that the transmission of this bad news, how medically hopeless he was the thing that probably triggered his recovery. In fact, if you wish to look up his story in the AA book, you can see from his point of view how this all happened. Meanwhile, I told him about the possibility of a chain reaction about drunks, or among drunks, about all of my failures in New York. Well, it was one of AA's great hours. Afterward, Dr. Bob, having forgotten entirely about his hangover, Ann invited me to come and stay at their house, which I did, the better to carry on the proxy fight. Well, we had a great companionship over there. There was Bible reading in the morning, 2 or 3 times a day, coffee. Bob got back on the job, and he began to feel much better, and his drinking stopped abruptly. But one day he said to Ann and me, rather shyly, that the time had come for him to go down to Atlantic City to that usual yearly medical convention. Ann's face fell, but I signaled her to let him go, and she did. Nothing was heard of the upcoming founder for some 5 days, when the conductor spilled him off the train at 4 o'clock in the morning at Akron. He was too sheepish to call up his house, where we were. He called up his nurse, and she and her husband came and got him, took him there, and when he had been put under a little treatment, they brought him back to his own home. Well, then developed a terrible dilemma. It happened at 3 days since, or 3 days afterward, rather, that Dr. Bob must perform an operation, something he had begun, a piece of work on the operating table that he just had to complete. Here he was in a terrible state of the shakes. How could he possibly perform this operation? So Ann and I undertook a day and night tapering down operation. And on the morning of the 3rd day, the day of the operation, it being about 4 o'clock, I looked across from my bed to that of Dr. Bob, and there he was, wide awake, of course. And he looked at me and said, "This is it. I'm going through with it." And I said, "Do you mean the operation?" Well, he said, "I hope the operation. But this way of life is for me." Well, he was still in rugged shape. Ann and I drove him to the hospital. Just outside, he had a final bottle of beer and 1 goofball. Went inside and performed that operation. You can imagine how we felt sitting there in that car just waiting. But after a while, he came out, drove us home, and then disappeared again with his car. And when he finally arrived on Ardmore Avenue next, he told us that he had been making restitution to people that he had harmed. He was beginning to practice what we now know to be AA principles. So that was the beginning for Dr. Bob and for me. Presently, Dr. Bob said, "But Bill, shouldn't we be working on other alcoholics? I know I'd like to do this, and we'd better take out some protection for ourselves." Well, I said, "Have you got any ideas? Where can we find some?" Well, he said, "I used to be on the staff down at the city hospital, and they have a ward. They're always coming in there. Supposing I call up a nurse I know." So he called this lady and explained to her that he and a friend from New York had a new method of drying up alcoholics. And the nurse, with some asperity, still with good humor, I imagine, said, "Well, Dr. Bob, considering your performance down here, I hope you've tried it on yourself." And he said, "Well, I certainly have." So said the nurse, "Well, we've got just the customer for you. He's just come into emergency, He's black both eyes of one nurse. He's in delirium. We have him strapped down and under control. Well, Dr. Bob made a few suggestions for medication, which the nurse noted, and he said, "We'll be down tomorrow." On the morrow, Dr. Bob and I saw the man on the bed, a phrase that has become so familiar to all of us. We were visiting one of Akron's prominent lawyers. He had gone all to pieces. He had been in the hospital 4 times in the last 6 months. And as he hopelessly told us, he couldn't even get home without getting drunk. So I told him the nature of his malady, quoting Dr. Silkworth. Dr. Bob told his experience so far as he had come, and still the man on the bed shook his head and said, "No, I'm afraid this isn't for me. I'm just too far gone. It isn't a matter of faith in God. I have faith in God, but I'm sure he hasn't got much faith in me. But come back again, won't you? You fellas seem to really know the score." So next morning we came, and we found his wife standing there at the foot of the bed. And our new friend, Bill, cried out, "Here are the fellows. They know the score. They know what this is all about." And then he went on to relate how during the night it began to come to him, if these fellows can find it, so can I. Bill's story can be found, if you want to read it in detail, in the book Alcoholics Anonymous. At that very hour, Bill said to his wife, "Please fetch me my clothes. We are going home." He went home, immediately engaged in a political campaign. In it, his adversary used his alcoholism, but Bill kept sober. And in all the years since, until his recent death, he kept the faith. Now we see in retrospect that this really meant that the first group of Alcoholics Anonymous had already taken shape in Akron, the city on the hill. I think, before concluding this part of the project, that all of us should humbly reflect on the marvelous chain of circumstances, doubtless ordained by Providence, which had brought us thus far. It required the humility of Dr. Jung in his office telling a patient, "Only a spiritual experience can save you. My art cannot." It required a messenger, his patient, who came to my friend Ebby. And then it required Ebby taking the time and caring enough to look me up. No personal link in the chain of those early events could have been more critical and important than that of Dr. Silkworth, the man we later called the little doctor who loved drunks. We must never forget that it was he who told us the nature of our malady. It was he who during his lifetime attended some 40,000 cases. After AA started, some 12,000 cases. Ah, yes, his contribution was indeed indispensable. He was, I repeat, the little doctor who did love drunks. And all this while, for years before, during all of those terrible times of drinking, Lois stood by me. If she hadn't, I probably wouldn't have been alive to be a part of this change. Lois, at this point, I should think it would be a good idea if you'd put on a statement on here of what your reactions were, first to my seeming to be well and so on, the reactions to the first early day.
Well, of course, I was overjoyed. And when I went up to see you in the hospital, you were so different. I knew something tremendous had happened to you. I knew that you'd never drink again. I never doubted. And I was, of course, tremendously grateful. And for quite a long time, that feeling of joy stayed with me. But after a while, it began to wear off, and I didn't know just what was the matter. And I found myself losing my temper over trifles. Until one day you asked me to hurry up and get ready to go to a meeting, and I threw a shoe at you. You remember? And that didn't concern you too much, but it did me. Why had I lost my temper over such a trifle? So I then began to think of my own relation to you and to myself, my inner self. And I saw that I was resentful, that somebody else had done something that I had wanted to do all my married life. My one purpose had been to sober you up. And then somebody came along and in 2 minutes did the job. I was also resentful I didn't have any time with you anymore. We used to have so many wonderful weekends together. We were so companionable. But now the house was full of drunks and I didn't see you anymore. You were always out working on somebody or bringing some new one home. I love to have a house full of drunks, but I didn't have that same feeling of need. I didn't feel that I was needed any longer. I had been terribly important before in my own life. I had a big job to do. Now I had nothing. I didn't know where I stood. I was still completely grateful for this wonderful thing. But I myself was confused and didn't know where I was, what my goal was. I've had a goal before. Now what was it? Then I realized that I too had to live by the 12 steps. It was just as important for me as it was for you. Not so obvious, perhaps, but just as important. So, that's my story.
Well, Lois certainly went on with the 12 steps. As you know, she did stay with AA, and as I have remarked before, she's had about 6,000 more people in this house. And she has posed, I'm sure, to many of our viewers and listeners, the tremendous problem that nearly all AA families have at first. We alcoholics have greatly deformed those near to us. And she has posed that problem and has since been a part of its solution in the Al-Anon groups. Well, let's round out this wonderful chain of events. I began to work with other alcoholics in New York. We began to go to Oxford group meetings, and there we met Dr. Sam Shoemaker, the Episcopal rector. What he gave us in the way of personal inspiration is beyond all description. His impact on us in those early days certainly registered, and the principles emphasized by the Oxford group later lent themselves very readily to the formation of AA's 12 Steps and the publication of our book, Alcoholics Anonymous. And we, from there, go to other indispensable people in the chain. Ann Smith, whose experience had been similar to Lois, staying by Bob. Bob, the first alcoholic to be sober following my own recovery. And then, to make a group where 2 or 3 are gathered together, came Bill. And so, for us of AA, that was the beginning. If this means of communication between us and you proves to be useful and a happy one, I hope we shall make some more of them. Meanwhile, God bless all of you, and Alcoholics Anonymous forever.